At the end of the 1960s, MLW proudly announced their new M line of locomotives. These are an evolution of Alco's Century design. Alco went out of business in 1969 and MLW decided to carry on with the product line but to improve it. And the M in M line proudly stood for Montreal, low maintenance, modular, and in my estimation, massive. The locomotives were re-streamlined and they gave them a very impressive, purposeful look by eliminating many of the bumps and the strange things that stuck out of an Alco locomotive. They came up with something that was sleeker, yet also massive and powerful. We're standing on the side of a Quebec Cartier M636. And one of the big deals with the M line and where the M in M line comes from is modular. The whole concept of the unit was to make the unit modular. It could be 3,000 horsepower, 3,600 horsepower, or 4,000 horsepower, depending on the prime mover. And many of the components were modularized. Under the cab, the air brake equipment was set up so that it could be entirely slid out in one module using a forklift. The other big thing about the M line in terms of being modular was the air system. MLW previously had always had a divided air system. They drew their combustion air at the back of the locomotive, but at the front of the locomotive they drew their air for cooling the main generator and for cooling the traction motors. And on the M line they tried to move it all into one. And they had this huge air intake, a FAR air intake up top, and inside was a giant blower. And the giant blower would spin the air, separate the dirt out of it, and the dirt would have been exhausted out through here originally, and the air was then moved forward to cool the diodes for the AC generator. Some of it was moved to cool the main generator in behind here. Some of it was moved down to cool the traction motors through traction motor blowers. There was a giant duct that ran the whole length almost of the locomotive to move combustion air back to where the turbocharger was going to inhale the air that the prime mover was using for combustion. Well, all of this was fine in theory, but in practice, MLW had never field tested this giant blower arrangement before they put it into production. And what ended up happening was the blower sucked way too much horsepower away from the prime mover. The blower's parasitic losses were extreme, so much so that not one 636 ever left the MLW plant producing 3,600 traction horsepower. The most they produced was 3,300 because the blower was robbing too much horsepower. Well, subsequent to their delivery, MLW realized their error and they produced kits that could be sold to the railroads to remove the giant blower from in here and put in smaller blowers. This no longer became the air intake. The air intakes instead were these. The smaller blower sucked its air in through these fiberglass filters, and the air was then used for the traction motors, for the main generator. It was also used to cool the dynamic brake resistors, which are on top of the roof of the unit just behind this grill. The air also went forward to cool the diodes again and to cool the electrical cabinet in the cab where there were electronic components. The one thing they did do though was they eliminated moving air all the way to the back of the locomotive for the combustion intake. So with the new simpler system there ended up a smaller blower in here. This was no longer where the air came in, and that smaller blower took less horsepower, and there was a chance then that the unit could actually produce its rated 3,600 horsepower for traction. And that's why you see on subsequent photos of these after delivery, these modifications put in. And CPR was supplied free by MLW with kits that were put into the 4716 and the 4553. CN was given one free kit. I don't know whether Cartier paid for the kits or were given them. Also, British Columbia Railway, who had these, did the same modification. And by liberating the air system and going in a sense, backwards in terms of their design, MLW was able to get the units to run much better. I've moved down closer to the rear end of the Cartier 636 to show you these combustion air intakes. These were not originally on the locomotive as delivered. These are the ones that were put in after the giant blower was stripped out and the duct underneath it was closed. So now the engine draws its combustion air directly into these. Turbocharger is right in about here. The exhaust stack is above that. So the combustion air comes in through these filters into an airbox chamber, and from there it's drawn into the engine where it's used to burn the fuel. One of the M-Line's other modular features was in the electrical cabinet. They used a lot of electronics, which was very pioneering at that time. 1969, 1970, a lot of the locomotives still operated with relays for things like power contactors, making transition, and MLW said, no, we're going to use cards with electronic components. And these blue cards up here that you see, these blue sort of pullouts, these contain the electronic components that handled things like loading, engine RPM, transition, and these were easily removable. You just grab the handle, I'm not going to do it, but you grab the handle, pull one out, and you can just slip another card in. If you expect there's something wrong, you just go take it out, put it on a test unit, and there was a test unit for CPR at St. Luc, one on CNR both in Moncton and Montreal, and you would test the cards, and if there was a problem with the cards, you just took another one off the rack, shoved it in, and your locomotive was back in service without any difficult electrical modifications.